The most important topics of the day. This program is for critical thinkers. And now, here's your host, integrated media professor, longtime Spokane Talk radio personality, and award-winning broadcast veteran, Mike Fitzsimmons.
Well, welcome to this edition of For Critical Thinkers. Today we want to talk about guns. It's a pretty timely topic since there's so much being discussed about that in the last few days. America, I want to talk about getting to the truth about some things. The truth about guns. We're hearing an awful lot of stuff, and much of it is not reliable at all. And since it isn't, we need to try to figure out how to get to the actual truth. Now, as always, if you feel you want to join the conversation today, here is how. Just simply send an email to sam@SpokaneTalksMedia.com. Sam is our producer, and he is going to send you a password. Now, I know this is a little bit awkward sometimes for some folks, but if you email, you get a password back, explain to you exactly how to log into this program so that you can talk with me live, especially if you have a camera and a microphone on your PC or your Mac or your telephone. We can do that, and I encourage you to do that if you desire to do it. Also, I want to thank again our sponsor and our underwriter, Stephen Major. Stephen is the fellow whose support makes this program possible. We would not be able to do what we do here if Stephen Major was not behind us, and he is very definitely, and I am grateful for that. And also, we always begin the program with a definition of what critical thinking is. Critical thinking is the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. Analysis, evaluation, and then the formation of a judgment. Now, opinions don't require evaluation. They don't require much in the way of knowledge at all. They don't even require the truth. So we're not talking about opinions here. We're talking about objective judgment about something. That doesn't mean that we have to agree. Judgments can be different. We can arrive upon them in a variety of different ways. So let's begin our inquiry, shall we? Into guns and gun violence and gun control and the contentious myths that seem to be embraced by this whole gun culture. To start with, let's ask this question. How many Americans own firearms? What would you guess? How many Americans own firearms? A lot of firearms out there, to say the least. In fact, the exact number of Americans who own guns is uncertain, and that's because there is no federal registration requirement, thankfully. In many countries, there is a requirement to register all your guns. The government knows exactly how many you have, what they are, where you keep them, a lot of detail about that. But we don't have to do that in this country. Therefore, the government doesn't really know. Estimates, however, by the National Shooting Sports Foundation place the total number of guns in America, gun owners, I should say, at about 100 million, perhaps a little more than that. So then the question becomes, how many guns do these people own? How many guns do Americans own? Some folks only own one, others own a whole lot of them. 423 million firearms are in civilian possession in these United States. It's a lot. Think about that. There are 330 million people, but there are 423 million firearms in possession across the United States of America. And most Americans own about 1.3 guns per household. That doesn't mean that you own a gun at all, but it does mean that given the number that's out there divided by the 320 million people or so that we have in this country, it works out that way. Here's a breakdown. 43% live in a household where a firearm, just back that up, if you will, to the previous one, if you would do that. Thanks. There you go. 43% live in a household where a firearm is present. 43% of Americans. And 30% of Americans own at least one firearm. Well, many Americans obviously own gun collections or a number of guns. Some even have complete arsenals. So we have a lot of guns out there. Now, 72% own handguns. That's the position from Pew Research Center. 72% of Americans own handguns, 62% own a rifle, and 54% own some kind of a shotgun. Now, gun owners who only have a single gun in the household, that breaks down to 62% of handguns, 22% of rifles, and 16% of shotguns. Nearly 5 million new gun owners were added to the ranks in 2020. Think about that, in 1 year. And by the way, 2020 was a year of uncertainty, and the statistics that I'm going to be giving you relative to the data that we need to be looking at here are going to be statistics mostly for 2019, because there was no COVID to skew the ordinary course of things over the 12 months of 2019 that there was in 2020. In any event, 40% of firearm sales last year went to first-time buyers. And that's unprecedented. That means that people are pretty concerned about things, and they have reasons for wanting to purchase a firearm, and we're going to get into those reasons in a moment. But if we take a look at a state-by-state breakdown, here's a map of the United States, and we're looking at the breakdown of gun ownership percentage of the population of each of the several states. Now, almost 58% in the state of Arkansas, 57.6 in the state of Arkansas, makes it the top gun owner state in the country. And the state of Idaho, where I live, is, and it's no surprise, by the way, but it's second at 56.9%. You'll note that on the coasts, both Washington, Oregon, and California, and then on the East Coast, the New England states and the Mid-Atlantic states, the number of gun ownership is down. And you'll notice that in the center of the country, in the industrialized center of the country, it's also a great deal less than you'll find guns in other households. That says something about the attitudes of Americans. That tells you something about who lives in these areas and why they feel being armed is important to them. Now, why do Americans own guns? Well, 67% of gun owners say that protection is the reason they have purchased and own at least one firearm, if not more. And 38% cite hunting as the major reason that they own a firearm. And that might explain some of those states that we saw on that map a moment ago, because a lot of those states have a lot of wildlife and a lot of big game hunting. That could very well explain why there are so many firearms there where there aren't in the much more urbanized coastal regions of the country. And 30% cite target practicing and target shooting, in other words, recreational shooting, as the reason that they own a gun. This is according to Pew Research. Make a note, though, that of the number one reason that Americans cite as to why they are armed is for personal protection. Personal protection, guns and self-defense. 67% of gun owners say that personal protection is the reason why they own a gun. 67%. Now, we live in an extremely violent country these days. These times are scary. I'm not suggesting that I'm frightened or that you ought to be, but the events that are taking place are scary. We live in a country where there's a lot of turmoil, where there's a lot of violence, where there's a lot of uncertainty at the present time. After many months of anarchy in the streets of some of the largest cities in America, where we saw buildings burn and businesses destroyed and homes broken into and people's personal property stolen and automobiles turned upside down, even police cars, and set ablaze. That frightens a lot of folks. That gives us a lot of ill ease, and we need to have some way of dealing with that. And perhaps the fear that that could come to our own doorstep is the reason why people own guns. With national crime statistics growing all the time, showing an alarming increase In violent crime and in property crimes, people are thinking that maybe gun ownership is a prudent thing to do. And in the face of a national movement to defund police, defund the police forces of a lot of large cities and even smaller communities across the nation, a lot of folks believe that the cops can no longer protect them and that they're going to have to take measures to protect themselves, and arming themselves is one of the ways in which we do that. Also, the inability to access information and a variety of different opinions and points of view and perspectives is causing folks to be a bit nervous about life in these United States, with big tech silencing Americans and censoring those with whom they disagree, whose opinions they oppose. And while politicians of both parties, Republican and Democrat, are cowardly standing by and doing nothing, a lot of Americans believe that they may necessarily not be getting information that is vital to their own protection and safety, and they must then consider taking care of themselves. And in an era where the news media is dominated by a corrupt liberal press that will readily lie to their viewers, to their readers, to their listeners, advance their own personal agendas, and to protect the powerful people in government they seek to keep getting elected. I mean, it's difficult to feel at ease in this country, realistically, isn't it? I mean, what has our country become? Well, this much we're sure. It's become something that makes us extremely uncomfortable. And when we're extremely uncomfortable, we take certain measures. And in the United States, in the history of the population of this country over the last just under 250 years, as a republic, we have taken those steps, those measures in the past, and it becomes necessary. This necessity of firearms in America was recognized by our founders. In the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, it was recognized by our founders. They wisely embedded the citizens' rights to keep and bear arms in the founding documents of the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment. Armed citizens were the insurance policy, if you will, the ability to protect ourselves. The Second Amendment reads as follows. We're a little ahead of ourselves here. The Second Amendment reads as follows. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. All right, so arming the citizens was seen as an insurance policy. The founding fathers said to the people of the United States, here is the Second Amendment. What is it here for? It's to protect the First and all of the other amendments to the Constitution of the United States, keep our government from intrusion upon our guaranteed freedoms. This little meme explains it pretty well. It says, founding fathers, here's the First Amendment. Oh, and in case someone tries to take that away, here's the Second Amendment. And some of our great leaders of yesteryear knew this in the process of forming this republic. George Washington, our first president, knew just exactly how important guns should be. Here's what he said. A free people ought not only to be armed and disciplined, but they should also have sufficient arms and ammunition to maintain a status of independence from any who might attempt to abuse them, which, and this is important to note, this is the basic sense of why we have a Second Amendment, which would include their own government. So the primary reason we have a Second Amendment is to protect ourselves, obviously from threats from without and from within, but mostly from within. In other words, government that intrudes upon us, that tramples upon our fundamental rights. Thomas Jefferson affirmed that very statement of keeping and bearing arms. Here's what he had to say. What country can preserve its liberties if its rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? And he said, let them take arms. Now, the founders didn't advocate guns just for hunting or for personal protection against persons who might otherwise threaten our own personal security. No, no, no. They were talking about protecting our rights with our weapons from our own government. The Second Amendment was created to afford every American the ability to defend themselves against federal tyranny. Defend themselves against federal tyranny. In other words, against their own government, if that needs to be the case. And I think in the present era, one might suggest that it does need to be the case. There are some things happening in which government this very day is encroaching upon you and upon your rights. They are basically taking almost every aspect of your life, in your bedroom, in your bathroom, in your kitchen, in your car, on your property. Now, some we might be able to agree with in the under the auspices of public safety, but some things are just simply overstepping. And perhaps a weapon isn't necessary to offset that, but if it gets any worse, a weapon might be necessary. Which brings us to the whole subject of gun control. Gun control. Remember the language of the Second Amendment: the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Government, as I mentioned, has been trying to test that admonishment ever since the ink dried on the Bill of Rights. You can be absolutely certain of it. They've been working to try to figure out how to get around some of this. Gun violence in the United States. Gun violence in the United States. Important things to know about it. There are actually 8 important things you ought to know about. Number 1 is that violent crime in America is actually down and has been on the decline for decades. To hear the news media tell the story, you'd never know it. You would believe that violent crime is just simply going through the roof. Well, in some areas it is, and in some demographics it is. But generally, it is not. Second, the principal public safety concerns with respect to guns are suicides and illegally owned handguns, not mass shootings. We define the threat from gun violence to be mass shootings. Understand, I gave you the statistic. Most Americans don't know it. Most gun violence, 6 out of 10 incidents of gun violence in the United States, involve an individual who is taking his or her own life. Suicide is the biggest form of fatality by gun. A small number of factors significantly increase the likelihood that a person will be a victim of gun-related homicide. In other words, we don't have to fear that every one of us has the same level of threat that everybody else has with respect to this sort of thing. If you don't live by the sword, generally speaking, you won't die by the sword. If you are not involved in activities that attract a certain level of threat and risk, you will probably find yourselves looking down the barrel of a gun. That doesn't mean you never will, and there's no possibility. You could be in the right place at the wrong time. That can happen, and it does happen. We all. But a small number of factors, and you can probably figure out what those are, actually contribute to individuals becoming gun victims. Gun-related murders are carried out by a predictable pool of people. You know, there's an old saying, and it's true, that of 100% of the population, approximately 4 to 6% of that population is going to be in what we would call the offender category. These are the people who commit crimes and commit them usually repeatedly. If you're not in that group, odds are you're not going to be too awfully concerned about gun-related crime, unless you happen to have a business that is robbed, for example, or whatever that might be. But gun-related murders are carried out by a predictable pool of people. Law enforcement has long been able to profile what kind of folks are likely to be gun murderers. They know who they are. That doesn't not necessarily mean that they know precisely what the person's name and address and telephone number is, but they do know the profile that individual will fit. And insofar as they know that profile, they are able then to adjust to that demographic in our society, or those demographics in our society, and psychographics, their attitudes in our society that may likely yield an individual who might use a firearm against another individual. Number 5, higher rates of gun ownership are not associated with higher rates of violent crime. In fact, the reverse is true. Higher rates of gun ownership doesn't equal higher rates of violent crime. The same roughly 4 to 6% of society is the offender, and has been virtually for tens and tens and tens of decades in this country. These are the folks who just tend to be in that category. There are reasons why that's the case without going into those in detail, but the bottom line is that the more people who own guns doesn't mean the more gun violence and gun crime. Quite the reverse. Indeed, the more people who own guns, especially those individuals who are carrying with a permit for concealed weapon, or are in open carry, tend to be a deterrent to crime, not a cause of crime. So there's no clear relationship also between strict gun control legislation and homicide or violent crime rates. If you take a look at some of America's most gun-ridden cities, where gun crime is at an incredibly high level, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, you take a look at Washington, D.C., Detroit, Baltimore, you find out there's an awful lot of violent crime. And there are also some restrictive gun laws there. Some of them are the most restrictive in the nation, and yet somehow or other, they don't seem to be doing much good. And there's also a tendency on the part of the American public to ignore certain categories of gun violence if it doesn't involve them either economically, socially, economically, or racially. Like for example, Chicago. Chicago has shootings in the 10s to 20s every single week, seems as though they do. Sometimes 4, 5, or 6 individuals killed, sometimes as many as 15 or 20 killed. Most of that is black on black violence. It doesn't meet the politically correct statistic of white on black violence, even if it's a police officer or a ordinary citizen. So we tend not to dwell on those things. A life is a life, and if Black Lives Matter is indeed more than just an empty slogan, those folks who are part of the Black Lives Matter organization should be looking into the city of Chicago and trying to figure out a way to put a stop to what's going on there. So no clear relationship between strict gun control legislation and the homicide or violent crime rate. Number 7, legally owned firearms are used for lawful purposes much more often than they are used to commit crimes or even to commit suicide. People go to the gun range and shoot for recreational purposes. They go hunting. They target practice. They do those sorts of things. There are lots of legal uses of firearms, and they far exceed any illegal or criminal uses, as well as any suicide. Most folks wouldn't commit suicide in the first place, and thus they wouldn't use their gun for that purpose. Concealed carry permit holders are not a problem, but they could be part of the solution to you. Now, those things you should keep in mind. A lot of Americans don't seem to understand that sort of thing. But you should keep those things in mind, because folded over all that's happening relative to gun violence, one discovers that it isn't quite the landscape that the media, or for that matter, the entertainment media, the cop and robber shows and all those sorts of things, the whodunits, would actually portray. It's really not that. But sometimes we get this sense that it is that, and a lot of folks get fairly upset and concerned about that. We're going to take a time out, and then we're going to come back to talk about what happened in the last couple of weeks that has now got gun control on the front burner.
The Wishing Star Send a Friend a Goat fundraiser is back. They are adorable, snuggleable, and hilarious. For 16 years, baby goats have brought joy to thousands while raising essential funds for the Wishing Star Foundation, which grants wishes for children with terminal and life-threatening conditions while supporting their families long after the wish. From May 3rd through the 7th, you can have a baby goat delivered to a friend, family member, boss, or coworker. The Wishing Star Goat Wrangler volunteers will deliver an adorable live baby goat directly into the arms of your recipient. For a $60 donation, this is a fun and lighthearted way to get some laughs and support the Wishing Star Foundation Wish programs at the same time. Place your order today at wishingstar.org/goats. Happy goating!
When COVID shut down construction, the Spokane Home Builders Association fought to get our industry back up and running. We are meeting the need of a record housing shortage with builder members like Eric Madsen Homes and Ryan Built Homes. Local experts, proven leaders. We are the Spokane Home Builders Association, building our community one home at a time.
Welcome back to For Critical Thinkers. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons. Let's take a look at some events that have happened just in the last few months and in the last few weeks that are very much a part of this overall discussion. We had an election in November, and Joe Biden was elected president of the United States. Now, I'm not so sure that many American voters truly understood last fall when they elected Joe Biden what it meant. That likely that he would attempt to infringe upon Second Amendment rights. Remember, Republicans are not the only ones that own guns. Democrats are the ones who own guns as well. But when he was running for president, Joe Biden made it pretty clear that he intended to do something about guns. He said, "My first day of office, I'm going to send a bill to Congress repealing the liability protections for gun manufacturers, closing the background check loophole, closing waiting periods." Now, that liability protection for gun manufacturers in most cases, unless negligence is involved, are not suable by individuals who have been harmed or who have had family members killed by the guns these companies manufacture. Unless there is some form of negligence that is demonstrated, that usually is not going to be the case. The fact that they were the maker of the product, and this, by the way, applies to other forms of industry as well. Airplane manufacturers, automobile manufacturers, appliance manufacturers, what have you. Unless there was some negligence or some actual duty of care that was breached, they are not liable for the way individuals who purchase their products use their products in the real world. But I'm not so sure, as I mentioned, that people were not completely aware of the fact that Joe Biden intended to come after guns. He has not yet, by the way, taken the steps that he mentioned in that statement that he made during the campaign to do the things he said he would do about gun control. But don't think he wasn't serious, and don't think he's finished with it. And then last month, 2 incidents brought this whole matter to the Atlanta spa shootings. One of 2 violent attacks on innocent people that brought renewed liberal hysteria to a boil and calls for gun control measures. The Atlanta spa shootings on March the 16th left 8 people dead. Immediately, there were claims of racism and calls for stricter gun control that reached a virtual fever pitch in these United States virtually overnight, powered by politicians who had lots of rhetoric, and of course by the press itself. And then just a few days later, adding to the rhetoric, was another shooting at a grocery store in Boulder, Colorado on the 22nd of March. 10 people were gunned down in that shooting, firming the stage, if you will, for urgent demand for federal legislation. This was at the King Grocery Mart in Boulder, Colorado, where that shooting took place. The president wasted absolutely no time for an immediate assault weapons ban. President Biden said, it's time we ban assault weapons. We must ban assault weapons. Here's the interesting thing. What most Americans who often pay little attention to the details of events of this nature, these two shootings left them still not knowing that the menacing looking assault rifles that they're familiar with played any role in this at all, and indeed they did not. In the Atlanta shooting, the grocery store shooting, the spa shooting, a semi-automatic pistol was the weapon used by the shooter, a semi-automatic pistol. And in Boulder, Colorado, the other shooting event that took place, another semi-automatic pistol was the murder weapon. No AK-47s, no AR-15s. But that doesn't mean that the intent of the left is to move forward on gun control and that these rifles necessarily going to be the only thing they look at. There are, as I mentioned before, 423 million firearms in America. 423 million firearms in America. Take a look at this statistic. And again, it is from 2019, and it's deliberately from 2019. The 2020 numbers are a little bit different, but the statisticians who have taken these numbers down suggest that 2020 was a very odd year because of COVID, because of lockdowns, because of interruption of ordinary life and activity in America, and thus the statistics are not necessarily reflective of the trends. So I chose to stay with 2019 as the last full year for which data was available. In 2019, the last year when COVID did not skew the statistics, we had 39,707 gun deaths in 2019. 39,707 gun deaths. Keeping in mind that the vast majority of those were suicides. Look at this graph. The vast majority were suicides, 61%. Homicides involved 35%. Legal intervention, that would have been police activity in the event of the commission of a crime, officer-involved shootings, if you will. Unintentional shootings, accidents, both at 1%. Undetermined outcomes, in other words, where the authorities couldn't tell exactly what the shooting was all about, 1%. Public mass shootings, 0.2%. Now, that data at the bottom of the screen, rifle deaths. Rifle deaths. From 39,707 overall gun deaths, rifle deaths accounted for 364. 9/1000ths of a percent. 9/1000ths of a percent. But it's this territory that Biden is concentrating on and the left is concentrating on. And the critical thinker recognizes, wait a minute, are you kidding me? This is where we go to the lowest score of all? Yes, that's indeed the case. Suicide has long been the cause that creates the greatest number of gun fatalities in the United States. But the rifle deaths in 2019 included suicides. And the rifle deaths was 364, which means obviously that a rifle is not the weapon of choice for someone who intends to take their own life, obviously. But most of these homicides, they were all homicides, most of them, other than hunting accidents and other forms of accidents. That number, by the way, includes assault rifles. It includes assault rifles. But when Joe Biden says that he wants to ban assault weapons, he means primarily two very popular rifles. The first, the AK-47. Look at that weapon. A lot of folks don't necessarily know what they're looking at, but that curved item that sticks out of the bottom of the weapon there, just ahead of the trigger cage, that is a magazine. That's what has bullets loaded into it. This is a semi-automatic rifle. And the magazines can be, in some states, only 10 in number in terms of the number of rounds in a magazine, or greater. In some cases of mass shootings that involved an AK-47, the number of bullets, of course, in the magazine was decidedly more than 10. And the other is the AR-15. The AR-15. Now, those both look pretty much alike. And they both look pretty much like a military rifle, don't they? They look like a military kind of a weapon. I mean, they don't have wood stocks. They don't have that sort of thing. They look like a military type of weapon. And if you're one of the millions of Americans, including politicians and news journalists, who believe that the designation AR in the AR-15 means assault rifle, well, you're in for a bit of a surprise. In order to be a critical thinker, you have to be an informed thinker. This is what AR stands for. Take a look at this. It stands for Armalite. Armalite. Armalite is a manufacturer's name. The AR-15 rifle was first patented in the 1950s by a now-defunct small arms manufacturer that was, in fact, a division of the Fairchild Engine and Airplane Corporation. And Armalite created the model AR-15. And it sold the patent in the late 1950s, 1960 it was, to Colt. Colt, you know, the gun manufacturer. Colt's been around for a couple of hundred years. That's where the AR comes from. It's not about assault rifle. People see AR and they think that means assault rifle -15. Doesn't mean that at all. Never has meant that. Joe Biden knows that politically expedient gun control icons like the AK-47 and the AR-15 are the place to start with his attack on the Second Amendment rights of Americans. Biden has decided that we are going to have to take down the assault rifles. These two is what he's talking about, these two. He's going to go after them first, but he has some additional provisions designed to discover just what Americans are arming themselves with and for the next steps in his plan. He wants mandatory registration under the National Firearms Act. Mandatory registration. If that happened, what would the government know? The government would know every single one of the weapons, the caliber that they are, that you own, and how many of them you have. They don't know that right now. I mentioned at the top of the show, there is no national registry at this point. But that's what he wants. It's going to be a contentious battle. He's going to put a $200 tax for each assault rifle owned. Why? What's the reason for that? Simply to make money. That's the only reason. It's a penalty to own an assault rifle, quote unquote, because they're really not assault rifles. And he's going to add an extra $200 tax for each high-capacity magazine. That simply means each magazine that is over 10 rounds. He's going to add that on there. So there's going to be some restrictions made to gun owners that'll hit them in the pocketbook. What is most comical about this effort, however, is that the AR-15 and the AK-47 have a counterpart that isn't included in this particular ban or this effort to legislate them out of existence. There are two rifles. Take a look at them in this particular graph. Two of them, all right? One of these is banned, the one on top. That's the so-called assault rifle. The other rifle there has the same ammunition, same velocity, same rate of fire, same capacity, just doesn't look as ominous. And the assault weapons ban will, excuse me, will ban only one of them, the one that looks like a military rifle. And what's the difference? Well, in the end, the difference is simply cosmetics. The rifle on the bottom doesn't look as threatening, therefore it doesn't get included in the ban. Politicians sometimes are not particularly good critical thinkers, if you notice. Between 1994 and 2004, you may recall, there was a ban of these very same assault rifles. And by the way, that rifle on the bottom in that last picture, that was spared. It was the ominous-looking military type rifle that wasn't spared. Congress banned the so-called assault rifle, and when the ban expired in 2004, Congress chose not to renew the ban after the expiration. The ban produced absolutely no reduction in firearm deaths, rifle deaths, gun deaths at all in that 10-year time. Indeed, they went up just a little bit in that same period of time in most states. The number remained about the same, however, for over a decade, so that ban actually had virtually no effect whatsoever before. The constitutionality of individual states instituting such bans is an undecided legal issue yet, as the Supreme Court of the United States has not yet heard a case directly on the issue. District courts remain somewhat split on the matter, specifically on what the test should be to properly evaluate what constitutes an assault weapon. So we don't really know the answer to that question yet because the Supreme Court has never had a case on point precisely. The National Shooting Sports Foundation has estimated, though, that there are approximately 5 million to 10 million AR-15 rifles in the United States in the hands of private owners. Between 5 and 10 million. Now back to the courts for a moment. Appellate courts have borrowed from the 2008 U.S. Supreme Court decision known as Heller versus the District of Columbia, which, by the way, was largely about a ban on handguns in Washington, D.C. And a 1939 case, a decision in what was known as U.S. versus Miller, which suggested that the guidance on what weapons could be lawfully owned under the Second Amendment should be based upon what weapons are in common use. All right? If that, in fact, is a key as to what weapons ought to be banned, we should ask the question, does the fact that there are approximately 5 to 10 million AR-15s and AK-47s in private ownership in the United States, is that a common use? I would suggest that it certainly is goes a long way toward that. The popularity of the semi-automatic rifle seems to satisfy the common use criteria, doesn't it? Because of a huge number of such firearms that are owned by Americans. Under this guidance, fitting under the title of assault rifles for purposes of a ban, are protected some of the most popular weapons sold in America. Get this. Sales of AR and AK style weapons in each year of since the ban came off in 2004 have outpaced the sale of F-100 pickup trucks in America. Pretty popular weapon, I would suggest. AR-15 rifles are not assault weapons. AR-15 rifles and AK-47s are not assault weapons. By definition, they are not. But the left intends to change that definition. Here is what constitutes an assault rifle. All right, take a look at this. AR-15 style rifles are not assault weapons or assault rifles. An assault rifle is a fully automatic weapon. The AK-47 and the AR-15 are semi-automatic weapons. Automatic firearms have been severely restricted from civilian ownership since 1934. These weapons aren't automatic. They're not machine guns. But as I say, the left intends to change that definition. They're going to have to work this thing through and it won't be something they can do overnight. And they're going to try a variety of legislative and of executive maneuvers, legislation in the Congress, House and Senate, and the president is going to try executive orders, and they're going to go after many more of the kinds of guns that we own as Americans. Here's a little liberal logic, and never overlook liberal logic. It really isn't logic at all when you get down to it. But anyway, what it aims to do is to convince sympathetic citizens with the help of a willing liberal media to ignore government's efforts to box in gun owners and control what firearms they might own or purchase, even if they're not AK-47s or AR-15s. That's supposedly liberal logic, right? Their strategy under liberal logic, after all, is to do something quite simple. Think about this. The vast ignorance, I've messed about the American people for a long, long time. What the firearms are, if they're not an assault weapon, because they are obviously not automatic but semi-automatic, let's apply the logic this way instead of looking at the actual statistics or the actual features of the rifle. Let's just say, or a handgun for that matter. What firearm is not an assault weapon if deliberately used to injure or kill a human being? You haven't heard that asked or answered very much, but that's coming. That's going to be a part of the rhetoric, the nomenclature of the left. You watch. What they're going to try to do is convince sympathetic citizens with the help of the willing liberal media to ignore government's efforts to box in gun owners and to control whatever firearms they might own or purchase. So the AR and the AK are just a starting point. It's kind of like, if you will, it's kind of like marijuana as the springboard drug to the harder stuff. The government is going to start with the AKs and the ARs and work on the anger and the fear and the ignorance of the American populace. And it's the ignorance of the American populace that's going to give them the opportunity to prevail in this process, which means that we don't have a whole lot of time on this particular subject matter to continue to be ignorant before we're all in serious trouble. Take another time out here. We'll be back with some closing remarks.
National Barricade and Sign Company is a well-established company founded in 1957. National Barricade has become a well-known business in the Spokane Valley for more than 50 years. Over the years, we have built long-lasting relationships with many cities, counties, and their departments of transportation. Customers come to us because they know they are going to get the best quality service at the best possible price. National Barricade prides itself on getting the job done in a timely manner. We know that contractors must have certain items in a timely fashion to get their job done, and if we don't have it, we will get it. We guarantee fast service no matter how long it takes.
Hi, my name is Liam, and I'm 6 years old.
Liam was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis at pretty much at birth, with Liam having to do treatments, breathing treatments every day. It's very worrisome because around our area there's a lot of fires and then there's harsh weather. So there was a day this summer where we were out of electricity. I want to say 5 in the morning till maybe 5 in the afternoon, and it was very hard for me not to have electricity because, I mean, we couldn't do his treatments. We spoke to Wishing Star and they were able to get us a generator, which was a really big stress relief. Anything could happen any given moment. We will be able to do his treatments and clear his lungs, even if there's fires or any kind of weather. For the donors of Wishing Star, I don't know where would we be, without them, with this donations that they do for us.
Welcome back to For Critical Thinkers. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons. So let's revisit that slide about liberal logic, the second slide, which simply exposes their strategy. What firearm is not an assault weapon if it's deliberately used to ensure, or to injure rather, or to kill a human being? So all guns can kill, and if they're deliberately used for that purpose, then they're obviously something that we have to ban or get rid of or control completely. And the way in which the left is going to move on this, mark my words, the vast ignorance of the American people are going to come into play here. Blind to the language of the Second Amendment, to the history of the Second Amendment, not knowing at all what it even means to them, the American people are going to stand by and allow the left to rein in guns of almost every single description over time. And the left thinks that it's laid a sufficient political foundation already to get this done. And they may very well have, but don't count on it. So, no matter how you feel about guns, you need to educate yourself with the historical truths of disarmed populations. We've got a lot of history where populations were disarmed and what became of them as a result of their not being able to defend themselves. We must understand what's happening on the American political playing field as we speak, right this very minute. We cannot trust traditional avenues of information without verification anymore. I'm talking about the American press. They're the politicians, and they are far left, and they're going to do their bidding. So we need, therefore, to educate ourselves. We need, therefore, to understand what has to be done, how to do it, and together with to get some strength in numbers in fighting what is going to be an attempt on the part of our powers that be to rein us in. Look what happened if you are not able to accept what I'm suggesting to you, and you don't necessarily have to agree with me, but look what happened with respect to COVID-19. A disease that has a almost 99% recovery rate regardless of your age was used as a pretense to shut this entire country down, destroyed our economy, put millions of people out of work at a time in which our economy was the most robust in all the world, put a lot of people out of. And how did they manage to do that? They created a level of fear, and fear makes even the most intelligent among us do things we wouldn't ordinarily do, think things we wouldn't ordinarily think, fear things we would not ordinarily be afraid of. And until we get information and are able to compare things and come to the conclusion, wait a minute here, this was a way over the top response to this process. It never should have gone that far. Well, if they'll see that it can be done with respect to a virus, you don't think they're going to try with respect to gun violence? You better believe they are. I want you to ponder this observation by one of the most evil, sinister monsters of the 20th century, if not of all time, Adolf Hitler. He made this statement: to conquer a nation, first disarm its citizens. And he did. The far left thinks that's actually an excellent idea. And they're going to try that. Are you going to let them? That's the question. That's all we have for today. This is an ongoing story. It's going to continue to unfold over a period of time. I'll probably have additional programs about this in the future. It isn't going to happen overnight. And like I mentioned last time, a frog in the boiling water, that's part of what the plan is here as well. We're going to gradually move in a particular direction. We're going to educate the ignorant American populace to feel comfortable with the moves that the government's going to try to take, even though they are unconstitutional and a violation of your Second Amendment rights. They're already doing it to your First Amendment rights. They're doing it to your freedom of religion. They're doing it to freedom of travel. There are a lot of things that are going on right now. Government is experimenting with substantially curtailing the freedoms you grew up with, the America of your childhood. Don't kid yourself by thinking that it is. And they'll do it with guns as well. If you don't own a gun, you may think, wow, I don't need a gun. I don't need any of this. Well, the day may come when you'll want one of those neighbors of yours who does own a gun to come to your aid. Hope it doesn't come to that. I'll see you next time. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons. This is For Critical Thinkers.
Thanks for tuning in to this edition of For Critical Thinkers. Join Mike Fitzsimmons twice each month for a chance to share your views about important issues that affect our lives. Stay tuned to Spokane Talks for our